What's up, deviants? Welcome back. You and the law. Got asked this question. I guess we're doing a little deviation here with respect. It's still part of constitutional law. Obviously, this is going to be a big one, but definitely had a lot of questions trickle in about divorce, obviously. So we're going to talk about it right now. Now, listen, this is not legal advice, and I want to say this in advance. There's no sort of legal situation, court situation that you should go into lightly, okay? Which means you're looking at a good 2 years of study before you even get close to being prepared enough to go into court and argue the matter. Now, I will give you a lot of the basic information right now, but it's up to you to formulate and substantiate using jurisprudence, the word of the court, meaning court rulings, your argument such that you can actually sort of persuade the judge to be like, okay, because trust me, these people, they play for the other side. They do not want you to be out from under the control of the state, because as soon as you do it, other people do it. And then, of course, the entire system of governance collapses. The only reason it's held together is because people are apathetic and ignorant. So as soon as you're not that, you become enemy number one, and trust me, they'll go after you. So you have to know everything there is to know about this stuff, and there isn't that much to know, but there is. And there are resources you can track down and stuff, especially certain forms of AI. Although I just watched a couple videos about my guy talking about his conversations with AI, and they're basically actively trying to bury this human rights information. Of course, you can see that from my own videos. They don't do nearly that well and stuff like that, mostly because they do not want this information to get out there. It is what it is. So that's the end of the intro there. We're going to get into, some preliminary stuff, and then I'm just going to break down the divorce stuff in some broad terms. And then it's up to you to get digging and, build that wall kind of situation. So let's get into it. All right. For the preliminary stuff here is, listen, you can get married. You just can't sign the marriage contract. So if you want to avoid all this stuff in the first place, you can go to a church, you can, pay a priest to marry you, you can exchange vows, you can put rings on each other's fingers. What you can't do is sign the marriage contract. I mean, you can sign the marriage contract, but it just makes things more difficult. So that's going to be, the first real consideration. And honestly, before you even get to that point, you want to be busting out some sort of contract where you essentially divide up your assets and make stipulations concerning any assets you're going to accumulate together, so that if your union does break down and stuff like that, both people get an equitable share of stuff, and that's the end of it. You can go to a normal court and just bring up this document and stuff, which you need to go get a public notary. I would even potentially sort of get a lawyer to write it up and stuff like that. But you don't need that. You can write them up yourself. As long as you get it on the public record and it's recognized in a format that's going to be admissible in a court of law, you'll be fine. Now, listen, if the person starts balking, if you will, at the idea of signing a contract that sort of puts strict limitations on what happens when your relationship dissolves, that should be a pretty big red flag. Doesn't matter which side it comes from. So, in a lot of ways, that's a great sort of litmus test, if you will, to determine whether the person that you're with actually wants to be with you because they love you, or because they have, designs on financial security. So that's got to be, the first real consideration there is sure, you can go through and have your wedding day and have family and friends and all the rest of that stuff, but it's an absolute sort of idiot level move to actually sign the marriage contract, because now you're putting all kinds of legal stipulations on yourself that are quite difficult to get out from underneath. And then, of course, you have the whole going to court and everything like that, and that sucks even more. Plus, you're going to have a major level uphill battle because the judges themselves are going to basically try to make your life a living hell. Like I said, they don't want you getting out from underneath the thumb, because it makes them money. It makes the whole industry money. It's an industry. It is not a court of law, if you will. I mean, it has the force of law, but it's an administrative court where they deal with money and division of assets and stuff like that. So if you're looking for law and justice and order and all that good stuff, you came to the wrong place. So just keep that in mind. It's not law and order stuff here. It's not whatever, night court. It's like one of those TV ones, Joe Brown, Judge Judy, or whoever it is, right? It's even though those might be actual real courts of law, I can't really say, but you know what I mean? It's a stylized version of it, which doesn't have as many teeth because they're limited by essentially the legislation that grants them the authority in the first place, meaning they can't go outside the Divorce Act and all the rest of that stuff. So obviously, they can't even hear constitutional arguments, meaning you can't invoke your rights per se. You understand? And we'll talk about that. You'd actually have to take the matter from the divorce court itself and challenge it in the superior court's jurisdiction and be like, I want this matter quashed and I want it moved up here where I can actually access my human rights in a court of competent jurisdiction that can hear all the arguments in one shot. And then you can cite whatever international covenant you want, in this case, most likely Article 2, but there are other ones too, of course, to get it done. Really depends on where you live, but of course the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is pretty much widely adopted by a whole bunch of countries, especially Canada, the United States, Australia, and probably almost all the European countries, even though they don't tell you. So that's got to be the first consideration. You know, decide for yourself if you need the ceremony and all the rest of that stuff, but then devise your own contract. And then, of course, there's nothing they can do because it has force of law. And that's just it. Once you sign on to a marriage contract and you have a prenup, this is why you see the prenups get thrown out all the time. Because the prenup is between you and the other person, not the statutory designation that you're entering under to go to the divorce court in the first place, the spouse. So let's get into that bad boy. All right, let's just cover some basic stuff. Essentially, there's two yous in the real world. There's the individual with their feet firmly planted on the ground, right? That breathes air, that has a job. They spend money. They go poop in the morning. They like their stupid little TV shows. They're kind of dorky like me and like to play guitar, whatever it is. Okay, the real world you. And the way our system of governance works, there's another you that's generated when you're born called the juristic person. Okay, and this juristic person, this blank slate, if you will, can take on juridical personality. And that is a fancy term for a statutory creature, meaning the driver, the resident, the spouse with respect to the Divorce Act, the hunter, the student, pick one, right? And you're going to see that everywhere. So individuals in their full legal capacity, human beings, they have rights as granted to them under the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, and of course, economic, social, and cultural rights, if you have that too. We do up here in Canada, so that's another one you should be checking out because there's lots of juicy stuff in there with respect to quality of life and all this good stuff interfering with your ability to work, which of course the divorce courts can absolutely mess with you on that front. So those rights, specifically to the, the civil and political ones, are 1.1, the right to self-determination, right? Then you've got 3, right, which ensures the right of men and women to enjoy all of their civil and political rights enumerated in the covenants, meaning you can exercise them whenever you want. You got 4.2, which is a non-derogation clause, meaning certain rights can never be removed or limited. Then you've got Article 5. That's basically being like, if the limitation doesn't exist in the covenant, it doesn't exist at all. And the government can't limit it using domestic law either. Then you've got, 8.2, I should say, which is the freedom from servitude. That's a big one. Basically, when you get into statutory designation, you're talking about being enthralled to someone else. Well, that's servitude. -9, liberty rights. 16, the right to recognition as a person. That's a big one. 22, the right, or I should say the freedom of association. That one's a little iffy, but the fact of the matter is you can't force an association. And so that's really the most important part of that right. Then you've got Article 47. They can't force you to spend your money on this. I know it's crazy. I was thinking about this one a couple weeks ago. They can't force you to spend your own money on some frivolous and vexatious legal proceeding and deprive you of the means of subsistence. That's also covered under Article 1.2. So you can kind of use those in tandem. And last but not least is Article 50, meaning that all these rights apply to everywhere on the landmass. There's nowhere in the country, doesn't matter if they're like, well, this is designated something else. You know, like Washington, D.C. or the city of London, if you're gone down the rabbit hole that far. That stuff doesn't work because of Article 50. It's the same everywhere. Right? So these rights you have basically give you the tools necessary to extricate yourself from statutory designation. Okay, so obviously you don't have to play the spouse. Now, here's the first mistake. People will be like, well, I'll just go to the divorce court and I'll invoke my rights. Wrong. That worked out. I'm almost getting, that's it. I'm watching the Terminator. Later, remember when he did? He holds up the shotgun and goes, wrong. That's awesome. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting sidetracked. If you go to the divorce court, I just said it, the jurisdiction is merely placed upon spouses. Therefore, they can't even hear your human rights, please. Okay? And you're going to blow your own foot off. The judge will be like, sorry, can't help you. Can't hear this argument. I don't have the authority. So you're screwed. So what you do is when somebody says, I want to get a divorce, and they serve you the divorce papers, the first thing you do is you request the court, a higher court, in this case, the superior court, which has inherent jurisdiction, meaning they can hear any question, human rights and otherwise. The divorce court stuff does not have inherent jurisdiction. That's why you can't invoke your rights there. But the Superior Court of Ontario or anything like that, they can absolutely do it because they have inherent jurisdiction. And you ask them to make a declaration to be like, am I required to play this character in law, the spouse, and then invoke all your rights and be like, because of all the ones I just gave you, and formulate your argument. And of course, you should definitely supplement that with various levels of jurisprudence, like Zinger versus the Queen, which cites Article 27 from the Vienna Convention, 1969, that says state parties, in this case Canada or the United States, cannot invoke domestic law as a justification for not complying with international obligations. That is a huge one because you're going to run into that for sure. So Article 27 of the Vienna Convention, 1969, go look it up. And there are other ones too. Baker is another good one, which basically says the same thing, but just in a slightly different way. And you're going to ask the court to make a declaration to see whether or not you have to do that. Now, listen, this is a very, very awesome strategy because it puts the government and it puts the courts in checkmate, right? You're going about this process in what I would call an honorable way because you're not outing them. You don't want to piss these people off. That's a bad idea. Instead, play the game of cat and mouse. It's like chess. You shouldn't get angry. And if you play the game well, they'll be like, nice. And they'll give you what you want. Because honestly, from my experience, judges actually like it when people fight back. But you have to make a seriously credible argument, and you got to follow the rules with filing the paperwork and all this stuff. If you do that properly, you make a nice, neat, concise argument, they will absolutely listen to you and give you what you want. But if you go in there with like this big, long, emotional diatribe that just spews out a bunch of, word salad, you're going to get your face ripped off, and you're definitely going to lose. Food for thought. That's why I'm like, it takes a couple years to really build up enough sort of knowledge, if you will, to be able to write something down that a judge would look at and be like, yeah, exactly. So, but that's the best way of doing it, because you can take that declaration where they'll almost undoubtedly tell you that there is no fundamental principle of justice that exists to limit or infringe upon your right of self-determination and recognition before the law, to force you into recognition as the spouse. And then you can take that document and you can file a motion to quash at the divorce court, being like, I do not recognize the statutory designation as the spouse. This is the corroborating evidence, this declaration from the Superior Court, which has confirmed my belief and the validity of this legal action. And then they'll just end the whole proceeding. And you'd be like, I'd like to proceed to the Superior Court's jurisdiction, where we can just divide up the assets using an application. Don't forget to add the last part, because if you just try to end the legal proceeding but still whatever stay technically married, they're probably going to get annoyed, right? So make sure that you're always telling them that it's just going to move to a different one. But the thing is at that point, you can you save yourself a lot of problems, and it eliminates their ability, of course, to yoke you to the spouse and then do all kinds of horrible things like garnish your wages, like steal your property, throw you out of your house, put you in jail, interfere with your ability to work, take your children away. Right? Those are all powers granted to judges that operate at the divorce court, because you've entered into recognition as the spouse, and they can do that to this statutory creature, which now you've assumed the duties and responsibilities of through your juridical personality. So as soon as you kibosh that, well, now all of a sudden they don't have that power and they can't really mess with your property. Food for thought there, right? So that's a very solid strategy for getting out of it. If you're already in the divorce proceedings, then you would ask for an adjournment at this point so that you can petition the Superior Court's jurisdiction for, for your human rights, if you will. And you'd file an application, of course, again, in Canada. Check under the rules of civil procedure. You'll see, I think it's under Section 3. You'll see it in there. It's the very bottom one of like this whole enumerated list where it says constitutional rights. So you can't really miss it, and I don't want to give too much away, obviously, because you need to study this stuff for yourself. Listen, and you have to know it regardless of whether you're going to get a lawyer or not, because if you don't know this stuff and you leave it up to the lawyer, you're going to lose again. You have to be watching them like a hawk. Okay, so don't entrust anyone to take care of your business but yourself. But that's really the crux of the entire sort of argument is do you have to be the spouse? And as soon as you remove that statutory designation, then guess what? The divorce court is powerless to do anything. And if they overstep the bounds, well, then that gives you grounds under the Constitution to go after them for forcing you into recognition, which is exactly what happened to me. I showed up to the landlord-tenant board, and they're like, you're the tenant, and then went crazy and tried to write judgments and all the rest of the stuff. And then I just absolutely obliterated them with respect to their legal arguments. But at the same time, I still have this feather in my cap or whatever, hanky in my back pocket, whatever you want to call that. And it gave me the opportunity to go after them for even more money and damages and stuff like that, because they did something they don't actually have the authority to do. The Human Rights Tribunal is the same. The Landlord-Tenant Board's the same. Divorce Court, the same. These are all administrative tribunals. Now, in this case, it's an administrative court. Same diff. Administrative means they don't deal with human beings. They can't hear constitutional arguments. That's why they call it administrative, because you're dealing with corporate entities, corporate bodies, in this case, spouses. And then they have all these rules and regulations for division of assets and powers and stuff like that to make your life a living hell. And they can use them as long as you remain ignorant and in this statutory designation. But the second you shuck it off, well, that just basically defenestrates them, meaning it throws them out the window, and they don't have that power anymore. And you can just stride around with your head high. And plus, let me tell you, Going to the superior court is going to instantly douse this person's whatever, hot, fiery indignation and stuff like that, because it costs about $70K to litigate stuff. So they're going to get a lawyer and they're going to get a big fat bill for about 5 G's up front. And then all of a sudden they'll be like, well, this sucks. And none of the rules for the division of assets actually pertain anymore, because it's unconstitutional to just steal your property and give it away to somebody else. And children, as far as I can tell, although you'd have to do more research on this, are considered to be your personal property up to a certain level. I think it's till they're like 16 or something like that. Then they become sort of quasi-independent, but still under your sort of guidance. And then when they hit 18, they're basically on their own and you have no more power. Unless they give it to you through power of attorney or whatever else, what other function it is, but we're not talking about that, right? So this prevents them from actually interfering with that and being like, well, you only get one weekend out of a month to see your kids and stuff like that. You'd be like, nah, we need to come up with a more equitable solution. And going to the superior court and arguing under the common law rules. And that's just it. You need to do quite a bit of research on what a tort is. A tort is a common law, lawful action based around constitutional rights, which of course is just human rights stuff now. And you can use that to your advantage to basically prevent them. And of course, that's sort of going to be essential for after you get done quashing all this garbage over here. But that has to be done essentially at the same time, right? Because shortly afterwards, you're going to be like, well, within 90 days, I'm going to file this other lawsuit and go to the superior court's jurisdiction and do what needs to get done. And at that time, of course, you need to have all these torts sorted out to be like, well, I think they did this. Or it also helps you make an argument to be like, I'd like to retain this, and this because it was already mine to begin with, and I don't see why I should have to give it up to anybody. Why should anybody be compensated for anything? If you had a house and all of a sudden they moved in and were living there with you for 10 years, but you already own the house or you made all the payments, well, what argument can you actually make in equity where you're like, yeah, no, this is half mine? No. Right? So again, separation of assets is something you should seriously consider in the beginning. And it's funny, China is already put these kinds of rules in, and it looks like the United States is quickly following, because marriage is collapsing as an institution, because obviously it's seen as a massive payday for women and whatnot, but not exclusively. And of course, now that the institution itself is dying, the debt slaves are basically drying up. And that's seriously problematic for the government, right? So honestly, if you were thinking about getting married, I might just hold off and wait until you starve them to the point of action, I guess you could say, where they forced to change the laws now, because otherwise the whole thing will fall apart. And they will eventually. Just keep starving them. But the long and short is that you have to avoid statutory designation. And there's lots of different ways of doing that. If they force you into recognition, you can file an action against them, or in this case, an application, and have that reversed. If you want to sort of be more subtle about it and sort of like, pull the rug out from underneath their feet. And here's the thing, if you do that, you can also rack up your own little bill and make the other person pay it, which of course would definitely go a long way to, again, quenching their sort of like their angry fire, because a lot of people look for revenge once they get into a divorce situation. So that's not so good. You can go after them for costs, which could put them behind the 8 ball. And of course, if you have money and you get into a court situation, you can just drive them into utter submission, where they have to actually bow out of the court sort of proceeding and just deal with you in a more sort of like mediation type atmosphere, which obviously gives you all the power. Be like, well, if you don't want to negotiate, and basically what that means is if you don't want to do what I tell you, then we'll just go to court. I'll bankrupt you, and then you'll still get nothing, and you'll have to pay for all my court fees. So, because you can make the credible argument to be like, well, you know, I tried to negotiate with these people, but they refused. They refused to listen to reason, and all I wanted was us to divide things up 50-50, and whatever you had coming into the relationship, you keep, and whatever I have, I keep. That's a reasonable position. Right? So you're not being unreasonable, and that's really one of the big standards in court is how reasonable are you being? And did you try to engage with this process honorably such that you just try to deal with the problem without actually having gone before a judge in the first place? Right? So never get angry. Never let your emotions get the best of you. Don't say anything. Do not talk in court, especially at the divorce court. You go in there and you make a request. I'd like to adjourn the matter because I need to bring it before the Superior Court because I feel like there's violations of human rights here because you're effectively forcing me into statutory designation. If they're like, no, then just be like, well, then I would invoke my right to remain silent. I have nothing more to say. And I will just take whatever judgment the court renders today or whatnot, and I will use that as the impetus to begin this other application process. And watch the judge be like, just stand your ground, right? They're always going to push the envelope, always. They are never just going to be like, oh, okay, sure. All right, it's over. No, man, it doesn't work like that. They will keep pushing you and keep pushing you and keep pushing you. So you got to be 2 or 3 steps ahead of them and sort of, outwit them and use the system that they've created to effectively bring them under your control. Remember, they're public servants, man. So they only have as much power as well, they don't have any power over you, really. Like, that's just the truth. I was going to say, like, in certain situations they do, but of course, without the statutory designation, they got nothing. They can't do anything. And that goes true for all of them. It's when you get into a situation where you're damaging property, you're committing a crime, an actual crime, or you're hurting someone and stuff like that, whether it's financially, whether it's contractually, or whether it's physically, that you start to get into a branch of law that you can no longer use constitutional rights. But in this situation, there's no aggrieved party per se. It's just the dissolution of a contract. Well, in that case, they need your consent. And of course, I would definitely write a letter or file materials with the divorce court being like, I do not consent to being recognized as a spouse and all the rest. You can do it there and just give them notice. And I would absolutely give them notice and then file all your reasons too. And at the same time, be filling out the paperwork for a declaration at the Superior Court and then just get that in there as soon as possible. Don't make it complicated. Short, sweet. If your request is more than like 5 pages, you're doing it wrong. And it should be like 2 or 3, maybe max. Right? So, and you'll pad it out a bit more because they need other things too there, like a title page and all this other crap. So it'll end up being like 10 pages or whatnot. But your actual material, your argument, or what the declaration part or what you're requesting should be like 2-3 pages. Just keep it very, very simple. Sit there and articulate the question incredibly well, and then just basically lay out all the facts. If you can substantiate it with actual jurisprudence, you'll be 10 times farther ahead of the game and almost assuredly get what you want. Okay, just going in there with the rights themselves, even though the courts are well aware of it, is good. But that'll be a serious weakness because they'll start asking you about it and you'll be toast. That's why I told you about Article 27, because that's one of the oldest tricks in the book that they use where they're like, well, this over here, this domestic legislation says we can do this. And that's when you go right in the face with Article 27 and you start citing Zinger versus the Queen and Baker. And that puts that on kibosh. They're like, oh, okay. And they'll be like, all right, well, we need to think about it. Bam. And then, of course, a couple weeks later, you'll get a judgment being like, yeah, no, you don't actually have to do that. And then there it is. Victory won, and you can proceed on. So I get it. Divorce is an incredibly sort of evil sort of proceeding now. And I saw some really hardcore stories. It seems like it's just getting worse. I saw one just recently about some guy talking about getting divorce graped. So this stuff is incredibly important. And, you know, it's funny. He was talking about his lawyer. He's like, I can't get a lawyer to help me and all the rest of the stuff, even though he was clearly in the right. And I'll tell you why that is. These people, they hang out on the weekends. They do barbecues and all the rest of this stuff. They're all friends. And so they will never bite the hand that feeds. They'll tell you whatever it is that you need to be told. They'll be like, oh, I'll go in there like a pit bull and all the rest of the stuff. You'll go into court and they will absolutely throw you to the wolves. And then afterwards, there's literally nothing you can do. Now, listen, with the constitutional stuff, there is something you can do after the fact, okay? Because nothing is permanent in that world. If there's an infringement with respect to the Constitution, didn't matter if it happened 6 months ago or 16 years ago, you have the right to seek a redress. There's no statute of limitations on the Constitution, none. And so you can still extricate yourself, but that's getting a lot more complicated and stuff, and I'm not going to get into it. But it's the same principle. You forced me into a statutory legal designation without actually explaining it to me. Right? And be like, you forced me into this thing without actually giving me the opportunity to consent to it, which of course sort of invalidates their orders because they were doing it in a way that was deceptive. And so there's a lot of wiggle room there, a lot. And of course they'll just get rid of it. They don't want a big legal problem because they can be held liable. Up here in Canada, use the Crown Liabilities and Proceedings Act. And I'm pretty sure there's the Federal Courts Act, which means if it comes from a federal court, you can go after them. I don't know if there's one specifically to these little administrative tribunals and stuff. But again, you just use the Crown Liabilities and Proceedings Act, 1985. There's two of them. Don't forget that. There's two. One's from like 2000, whatever, 15, 19, something like that. There's another one from 1985. That's the one you want, okay? Notice the other one. Read the two of them. You'll be like, dude, oh my God. Wow. Whoops. And they're both fully in force. Just another scam by the government to try to cover their tracks and avoid any accountability, right? So, challenge the statutory designation. Use the international covenants. Ask for a declaration from the court. If you have to, escalate it up to an application where you're like, you're in violation of my constitutional rights. Formulate a killer argument. Keep it brief, to the point. Substantiate everything you're doing with jurisprudence. That's going to be the worst part because you're going to spend literally months on a legal website or going through stuff. Learn how to use the search function. Type in keywords like individual, spouse, natural person. And when you see, creditor and debtor and stuff like that, I was going to say debitor. Nice. Creditor or debtor. And it says individual there. Well, then take the word creditor and use that as a reverse search and then see how that ties in with the spouse. That way you can fully flesh out your argument. You'd be like, you're forcing me here. Then the spouse becomes the creditor. And now the creditor is attached to the individual. Well, I don't want to do that because it's in violation of Article 47. It's in violation of Article 1.1 and 1.2. Done. Okay? No one can force you to cough up money to give to somebody else if it means that you're going to be denied a means of subsistence, meaning they can't just take your money. That's all it means. It's the same with taxes. It's the same with everything. All of that stuff falls under Article 47. Fees, permits, taxes, all of it. You probably don't even have to pay court fees, although just pay the court fees if you can. They're pretty reasonable. It's like $400 or $500, maybe a couple grand. Trust me, it's going to be easier than trying to, start up World War III with these people. And they'll be more likely to be like, all right, just get out of my court. Just getting it done is going to be far preferable than worrying about a couple $1,000. Especially if you're going to get out from underneath the responsibility financially of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars lost. So I hope that sort of pulls back the curtain a little bit on the divorce thing. And of course, again, knowledge is your best sort of defense. So don't take it halfway. If you're going to go balls deep and get it done and really sort of pad out your information base as much as humanly possible so that you can foresee the kinds of, legal attacks you're going to receive. And of course, they're going to come directly from the judge because they don't want you to be like, oh, no, I don't want to do that. Of course, if you do that, and you'll know immediately, if you start doing stuff like that and the judge is like, well, we'll have to see you in chambers, then you know you've already won, because they'll basically be like, what do you want? And then you just basically state what you want, and they'll basically probably comply with most of it. Be reasonable. If you try to go over the top with your ridiculous demands, you just shoot yourself in the foot. Just get out of it. Lesson learned. Move on, okay? Don't get greedy, because you'll just basically rip your own face off, and that's not a good plan, okay? So, those are some little sort of pointers and hints and whatnot about what you can do to immediately stop these types of pernicious legal attacks. And of course, last but not least, get ready for the long haul, but you can strategically plan, if you will, with respect to the finances, and then just drive the other person into financial submission. So if you're making good money and they're like a stay-at-home mom, as brutal as that sounds, no lawyer, no divorce lawyer, a real lawyer, really at that point, is ever going to take on somebody that doesn't actually have any money. They will do the absolute bare minimum, which means that you can just absolutely destroy them. Now, listen, I know that sounds a little vindictive, but whatever, they were the ones that brought the pain, so it is what it is. So it's a great way to essentially, understand that you have many avenues. You can starve the person out, financially, so to speak. You can avoid statutory designation. You can avoid them basically stealing any of your physical assets and whatnot. And last but not least, you can avoid all of the other sort of like more extreme stuff, like removing your professional licenses, which means you can't actually work anymore, and any of that stuff, or suspend your driver's license or put you in jail. Go look at I can't remember what the article is now under the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights. It's got to be between 10 and 20 or something like that, but they can't put you in jail for your inability to fulfill a contract, which is exactly what the divorce court does. So if you're a person that's facing jail time, you would go in there and invoke that and be like, well, send the spouse to jail, which is a statutory creature, but I'm not the spouse. So that's it for you. If you have massive sort of debts with respect to child support and stuff like that, again, Article 1.1, Article 47, Article 16 are going to be your best bet. And essentially, you can just shut them down and be like, I don't owe you anything. And that's the end of that. Now, you're going to be, you should be prepared for a pretty serious legal battle, but you can get her done. So there it is. I hope that helps give you a bit of direction, and I'll leave it in your trusty hands. Of course, if there's questions, you can put them down in the comments. I can't really do much with the comment section, right? And realistically speaking, what you should do is just start learning about the international covenants and reading judgments and building up a war chest of jurisprudence, if you will, to sort of fully understand your idea. Nothing will train you better for going into a court situation than sitting there reading some judgments about what goes on in the divorce court and stuff like that, especially pertaining to your stuff. And you'll just have to start refining your search criteria down and down until it gets more specific to your exact situation. But then once you do that, which can take a couple months, of course, or longer, took me years to collect all the stuff, so take it with a grain of salt. But once you do that, you become an unstoppable juggernaut, and you don't have to fear anything. And then all sort of like trepidation just melts away, and you just rise to the challenge, and you go full emperor mode, and you just like with the lightning bolt fingers, and it's over. See you in the next one.